Hello and welcome to lecture number 44. This is topic 3.9, Black Organizations and Institutions. There is one learning objective today: explain how African Americans promoted the economic stability and well-being of their communities in the early 20th century. One of the key things to remember about this time period is that it is referred to as the nadir of race relations, a time when African Americans were experiencing Jim Crow segregation, threats of violence from white supremacist groups, and widespread lynchings throughout the country. Between 1880 and 1930, more than 3,000 African Americans were lynched, mostly in the South, highlighting this era's violence. And the first way in which African Americans promoted their economic stability during this time period was through the creation of businesses and organizations. This was in response to their exclusion from broader society, particularly from white businesses and institutions. For example, they started their own grocery stores, barbershops, and tailor shops that catered to Black needs and did not discriminate against their patrons. In 1910, African American businesses were booming in cities like Chicago, which had over 500 Black-owned enterprises by the time of the Great Migration. Additionally, Black-owned banks and insurance companies were extremely necessary for African Americans to gain access to credit and loans, which they were less likely to receive from white-owned banks. One of the most notable financial institutions of this period was the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, founded by Maggie Lena Walker, the first African-American woman to charter a bank. Another example of these institutions was the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, founded by Alonzo Herndon, a former slave who became one of the wealthiest Black businessmen in the country. By 1922, Atlanta Life was one of the most successful Black-owned businesses in the United States, with branches in several states and $400,000 in assets, a significant sum at the time. African Americans also created civil rights organizations like the NAACP, which advocated for civil rights and fought legal battles against Jim Crow laws. They paid for and fielded lawyers to argue lawsuits against municipalities, cities, and states that were enforcing segregation. These efforts were made more necessary by the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case, which upheld racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. This ruling became the legal foundation for Jim Crow laws across the South, affecting public schools, transportation, and housing. The NAACP, founded in 1909, would later challenge this ruling in court cases that paved the way for the civil rights movement. In 1915, the NAACP secured a major victory with Gwynn versus the United States, which struck down grandfather clauses that had disenfranchised Black voters. Education institutions were another crucial area where African Americans sought to promote the well-being of their communities. Historically, Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, were essential for African Americans to gain higher degrees. Howard University, established in 1867, became a hub for Black intellectuals and civil rights leaders, including Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first African American Supreme Court justice. In previous lectures, we discussed the Tuskegee Institute, which provided industrial training for skilled workers in the South. The institute was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881 and became a model for vocational education, particularly in agriculture and mechanics. By 1915, Tuskegee had trained over 1,500 African American teachers and professionals, a significant contribution to the education of Black youth. These Black-owned businesses and organizations catered to the needs of Black citizens and improved the self-sufficiency of their communities. In some areas, such as the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, African Americans built thriving communities. However, this prosperity was often met with violent backlash, as exemplified by the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, when white mobs destroyed much of the district. In the aftermath, estimates suggested that over 300 Black residents were killed, and the economic loss for the community was incalculable. Another institution that played a significant role in the period was the Black press. The Black press expanded in response to exclusion from the white press. Examples of Black newspapers from this time included the New York Age and the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, co-owned by Ida B. Wells. Wells was a pioneering journalist and activist who used her newspaper to expose lynchings as a tool of racial oppression. Her activism eventually led to the anti-lynching campaign in the 1890s and early 1900s. The Chicago Defender was another influential newspaper for which Wells also wrote, detailing the events of race riots across the country. The Chicago Defender was known for its bold editorials calling for justice and civil rights at a time when such advocacy was dangerous. It reached over 200,000 readers weekly by the 1920s, many of whom were African Americans in the South. There was also the New York Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier. These Black newspapers provided African Americans with news that would have been ignored by white-owned newspapers, such as civil rights issues, and they advertised job opportunities, especially during the Great Migration. The Pittsburgh Courier, for example, played a crucial role in the Double V campaign during World War II, advocating for victory abroad and victory over racial oppression at home. These newspapers also documented aspects of community life and celebrated local achievements. They served as a platform to protest discrimination and encourage boycotts, such as the one Ida B. Wells promoted after the lynching of her 3 friends in Memphis. This boycott, alongside her investigative journalism, helped spark national discussions about racial violence. The Black church was another critical institution that continued to grow during this time. African Americans had a long history of creating their own churches, such as the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church, founded in 1816 as the first Black Christian denomination in the United States. After Reconstruction, the largest Christian denomination in the South was the Black Baptist denomination, which boasted over 1.3 million followers. Many of the ministers in these churches had little formal education, and many had been formerly enslaved. The structure of the Baptist churches, which gave full autonomy to individual congregations, contrasted starkly from the hierarchical structures of denominations like the AME Church or the Catholic Church. This decentralized structure allowed each congregation to tailor its practices to the needs of its community, making the Black Baptist Church a unique source of empowerment and local control. During this period, the holiness movement also emerged, spreading into Black communities. The Church of God in Christ, founded in 1897, became the largest African American holiness denomination. Related to this movement, William J. Seymour helped spread the Pentecostal church after establishing his congregation in Los Angeles, where he popularized the practice of speaking in tongues. This event, known as the Azusa Street Revival in 1906, is considered the birthplace of modern Pentecostalism and had a lasting impact on the development of African American religious practices. While Black Catholics were a minority with about 200,000 members across the United States, they continued to suffer from discrimination and were often relegated to segregated services in schools. During this time, the Black church's role in the Nadir was primarily to serve as a safe space for organizing, worshiping, and cultural expression. Worship was the central element of Baptist churches, providing a refuge from the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws and racial violence. Churches often became community hubs where African Americans could meet safely to discuss social and political matters, further solidifying their role as centers of both spiritual and civic life. The church services led by Black preachers were highly charismatic and emotional. Preachers used an impassioned, often dramatic preaching style, which resonated deeply with the congregations. These services also included participatory elements when the congregation would engage in a call and response style of worship, frequently shouting amen or offering other vocational affirmations during the preacher's sermon. This practice was not only a form of religious expression, but also a reflection of African cultural traditions that had been preserved and adopted in the context of American Christianity. Music was another key component of these services. The spirituals, which had been sung during the period of slavery, evolved into gospel music during the early 20th century. Thomas A. Dorsey, often referred to as the father of gospel music, was one of the key figures who helped popularize gospel by blending sacred themes with the rhythms and melodies of the blues. Gospel music became a powerful tool for both worship and emotional expression, offering comfort to congregants facing the constant threat of violence from white supremacist groups. Many songs reflected the themes of hope and resilience, helping to spiritually fortify Black communities during times of intense racial oppression. For some, the messages of salvation they heard in church helped to assuage the constant fear and threat of violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized Black communities throughout the South. Like many other churches, Black Baptist congregations promoted virtuous habits and denounced sinfulness. However, the level of political or radical messaging from the pulpit often depended on the preacher and the surrounding white community. Preachers like Henry McNeil Turner openly criticized white supremacy and advocated for Black empowerment, while others adopted a more cautious tone to avoid provoking hostility. Some ministers outwardly denounced white supremacy, but others avoided the topic, fearing that the local white community might retaliate by vandalizing or threatening their congregation. Despite these challenges, the Black church remained a crucial space for resistance and survival, offering spiritual strength, cultural affirmation, and even early seeds of political mobilization that would later blossom during the civil rights movement. The Black church helped nurture leadership and other cultural elements within the Black community. For example, many Black activists emerged from the Black church. Some of the most famous civil rights leaders who led the long civil rights movement in the mid-20th century were ministers and preachers. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, are two of the most prominent examples. The SCLC played a pivotal role in organizing nonviolent protests, such as the 1963 Birmingham campaign, and were one of the organizing groups for the March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech. There was also influential musicians who came out of the Black church, singing gospel music, spirituals, and hymns that evolved from this religious setting. Many of these gospel songs blended African rhythms and call and response traditions. Gospel music, with its roots in spirituals, became a powerful tool of emotional and spiritual uplift during the civil rights movement, often sung during marches and protests. The most famous group performing these gospel hymns was the Fisk Jubilee Singers, an a cappella group that got its start at Fisk University. Founded in 1871, the group helped to popularize Negro spirituals, touring internationally to raise awareness and funds for Black education. The Black church also helped nurture political leaders. Some preachers eventually made their way into politics. One of the most prominent examples is Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Powell was elected as a U.S. representative in 1945 and served in Congress until 1971. He became the first African American to represent New York in Congress and was a powerful advocate for civil rights and social justice. As chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, he played a role in passing legislation such as minimum wage increases and anti-poverty programs. In the photo on the screen, Powell's picture standing next to President John F. Kennedy, symbolizing his influence at the national level. Powell's political career was groundbreaking as he fought against segregationist policies in Congress and advocated for equality for African Americans. Finally, we'll end with an example of Black entrepreneurs who embody the spirit of self-sufficiency and economic empowerment. So we're looking at Madam C.J. Walker, born in 1867 to formerly enslaved sharecroppers in Delta, Louisiana. After a difficult childhood, she was orphaned at 7 and widowed at 20. She developed a hair care product that became extremely popular. Walker became the first woman in the U.S. to achieve millionaire status, helping to foster Black economic advancement. Her company, which employed over 20,000 women by 1917, became one of the largest Black-owned businesses in the country. Her success was not just personal. She used her wealth to support community initiatives, donating to the NAACP and funding Black schools and orphanages. She also provided economic opportunities for other Black women who became known as Walker agents and sold their products door to door. And finally, to recap, Black businesses and organizations grew during the Nadir as a response to exclusion for broader society. The Black press provided essential news and documented community life. Black churches expanded, nurturing cultural and political leaders. And figures like Madam C.J. Walker embodied the spirit of Black entrepreneurship, using their success to uplift their communities. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.